In the summer of 1812, more than 500,000 men marched eastward. They believed themselves to be the most perfect military machine ever assembled. A mosaic of nations driven by the will of a single man. 5 months later, under 27 degrees below zero, the most powerful army in the world ceased to be an army. It became a procession of specters. Lips froze. Thought slowed. The air itself seemed solid, made of ice. Friendship did not survive hunger and cold. Men looked at one another with suspicion. Survival narrowed desire until it was willing to accept anything. All no longer meant glory, loot, or victory. It meant a dry coat, a piece of meat, a few hours of sleep without waking up shaking. Official history speaks of strategy, decisions, and maps. But the war lived by those who marched through it tells something else. Collapse was not a single moment, nor an isolated mistake of command. It unfolded slowly inside the body. Hunger turned comrades into threats. Cold paralyzed gesture and reason. Exhaustion dissolved hierarchy and emptied the war of meaning. In this video, we will not follow Napoleon's plans. We will not retrace the campaign through diagrams. We will observe the moment when war ceases to make sense. The moment when it stops being strategy and becomes only sensation. Pain, numbness, degradation. Because in 1812, the defeat of Napoleon's imperial army, the Grande Armée, did not begin in the snow. It began when obedience stopped translating into movement and soldiers' bodies no longer responded. The campaign began as so many others had before. One marched because there were orders. One obeyed because hierarchy was visible. One endured fatigue because one believed in a plan. For soldiers like Sergeant Louis-François Bourgogne, war was not a plunge into the unknown. It was the natural unfolding of a system that had already proven its effectiveness. After years of victorious campaigns under Napoleon, the possibility of failure simply did not exist. Confidence in the emperor took on almost religious contours. It was believed that under his presence, everything would organize itself, decisions would align, obstacles would be absorbed. The machine would move forward. The Grande Armée, the multinational imperial army created by Napoleon, was not merely a military force. It was a moving community, governed by precise technical hierarchy and by an order that seemed to transform war into method, spectacle, and glory. This world made sense because it promised closure. One marched with the conviction that accumulated suffering would be rewarded by a decisive battle, not merely as a military event, but as confirmation that the entire effort obeyed a recognizable logic. When the distant sound of artillery was finally heard, Bourgogne records a reaction of relief and exhilaration. It was proof that the enemy had accepted confrontation, that the long march would end in clear, intelligible hours of combat. In that moment, war seemed to justify itself. That confidence rested as well on repeated experience with a particular way of fighting. Napoleonic strategy favored rapid campaigns, relatively light forces, continuous movement, and the concentration of strength at the decisive point. The army lived off the land it crossed. Cities meant depots. Villages meant food. Inhabited space meant sustenance for the military body. This logic, what historians call a war of movement, was not perceived as theory. It was practical evidence. For Bourgogne and his companions, it was as natural as marching. The same applied to time and shelter. Each day's march was meant to end under a roof. Any roof. Sleeping in the open was the exception, not the rule. Night fires structured the rhythm of the campaign, separating effort from rest and allowing the body to keep functioning. The duration of the war itself seemed manageable. There were seasons, calendars, decisions capable of anticipating difficulty. It was believed that the time of war could be governed by human will. Even violence appeared to obey recognizable limits. Houses were meant to provide shelter, not traps. Wounded men were to be captured, not annihilated. When French soldiers began to encounter incendiary devices hidden inside stoves, or civilians willing to destroy themselves in order to kill the enemy, Bourgogne's recorded astonishment was not late moral judgment. It marked the rupture of an earlier expectation, that even in its brutality, war still shared minimal rules. Behind all these certainties, order, decision, subsistence, shelter, limits, lay a deeper expectation still. That war would not erase the subject. One expected to pass through the campaign still being someone. The obsessive attention to polished boots, powdered hair, and maintained ranks had less to do with vanity than with preserving identity. When Bourgogne describes men dressed in improvised garments, fabrics torn from houses, or women's clothing, he is not merely recording material misery. He is registering the visible deformation of a condition meant to remain recognizable. The army still imagined itself as a vast imperial community organized by clear hierarchies and predictable rewards. At the end of the road, one expected return: promotions, crosses of the Legion of Honor, signs of belonging and recognition that would seal the combatant's identity as a conqueror. At that early moment, the march did not lead into emptiness. It led into a world that seemed to make sense. The war Napoleon brought to Russia was not designed to stop. It depended on continuous advance. While the armies of the previous century had organized themselves around waiting, siege, and patience, the Napoleonic world moved. Marching was not a phase of the campaign. It was the normal condition of war. This form of fighting, the so-called war of movement, depended less on accumulated force than on time, speed, and the ability to appear where the enemy did not expect. For the soldier, this logic did not exist on maps or diagrams. It was felt in the feet. One walked for most of the day. One stopped only long enough to eat something quickly, sleep a few hours, and resume the road before the body fully cooled. Fatigue was not a deviation from the plan. It was part of it. As long as the legs responded, the war still seemed to obey a comprehensible logic. That confidence came from habit. For years, this way of fighting had produced rapid victories, campaigns concluded in weeks, enemy armies disorganized before they even understood what was happening. Marching hard made sense because it promised an end. That is why, when artillery fire finally appeared on the horizon after long days of advance, it was received with relief. Bourgogne records the army's reaction upon hearing the cannon. It meant the enemy had not fled, that effort had direction, that the march was not empty. The sound did more than announce a battle. It confirmed that the familiar game was still being played, that the slow, exhausting advance would lead to a clear and intelligible moment of confrontation. War, at least for now, justified itself. This form of war depended on a very specific relationship with territory. Soldiers carried less weight and learned to seek sustenance along the way. Eating was not comfort, it was function. Villages, farms, and cities were treated as temporary reservoirs of energy. The land being crossed was part of the military mechanism. Bourgogne writes as someone for whom this was self-evident. Reflecting later on Moscow, he notes that it would not even have been necessary to burn the city. Removing its provisions alone would have forced the army to leave within days. The method still seemed sound. The world, up to that point, still responded. For the system to function, the army could not advance as a single block. It spread into multiple corps along different roads, living off what they found across wider areas. On paper, all would later converge on the same point. On the ground, this meant the individual soldier rarely perceived the whole. He saw only his column, the men ahead of him, and the road stretching forward. Everything beyond that was trust. Trust that distances were being calculated correctly, that time was being managed somewhere above, even though no one there could verify it. One marched, trusting that someone, somewhere, knew when and where everyone was meant to reunite. That trust gradually replaced understanding. Orders descended through the chain of command and were executed without discussion. The figure of Napoleon functioned as an invisible guarantee that movement had meaning. Even absent, he organized the march, or so it was believed. The memory of past victories made hunger, cold mornings, and repeated exertion bearable. In the body, the war of movement accumulated quietly. Boots hardened, feet swelled. Clothing remained damp for days. At night, men lay close together, not out of camaraderie, but necessity. Heat was shared. Words in different languages crossed the darkness before short, shallow sleep. At dawn, no one rose restored. One rose functional. The column reformed before full light. Some took longer to pull on their boots. The line did not wait long. Movement resumed almost automatically. As long as belief remained that effort would be rewarded, the system held. One marched because one believed the march had an end. The army advanced, sustained by obedience, habit, and the conviction that suffering still served a purpose. Napoleon did not need to appear every day to be present. His image functioned as a silent guarantee that the road still led somewhere. That was the war of movement seen from within. It had not yet collapsed. It had not yet stopped. But it demanded continuous motion from bodies moving through a space that was beginning, slowly and silently, to give less than it once had. The advance continues, but arrival no longer concludes anything. After entire days of walking, the men enter low, scattered villages, just as they entered so many before. They spread through the houses, open doors, examine ovens, search cellars, pry up floorboards, push aside furniture. They look for bread, flour, grain, anything that might interrupt the accumulated fatigue. They find cold walls, empty spaces, recent ashes. They leave as they entered. The march turns into a sequence of entrances and exits that produce no shelter, only confirm that they are moving through a territory where there is nothing to be found. When villages give way to cities, the scale of emptiness expands. In Smolensk, the streets burn. Fire offers no usable warmth, only excess. Entire warehouses collapse into compact masses of embers. Sugar stores melt and harden on the ground. The city becomes a furnace. Everything is hot, but nothing warms. Wind cuts through the streets, carrying sheets of iron torn from rooftops and flinging them into the air like leaves. Moscow appears first as astonishment and quickly becomes uninhabitable ruin. What should sustain an army turns into useless excess, a conquest that provides no shelter. Within this landscape, the logic of value begins to fail. In Moscow, soldiers take everything they can carry, including things they do not know whether they will ever use. Packs fill with sugar, rice, gold and silver ornaments, embroidered silk garments, fragments torn from churches. The accumulation grows less from greed than from uncertainty. Only days later, these same objects lie abandoned along the road. The path is cluttered with valuables, paintings, candlesticks, books, volumes of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Buffon discarded when their weight becomes unbearable. Empire, transformed into burden, is shed step by step. Even when food is found, it no longer restores. Men eat whenever they can, without pause. Horse meat is cut hurriedly, sometimes raw, sometimes barely warmed enough to swallow. Hunger drives them to dig in fields for sprouted potatoes, overly sweet, almost inedible. Thirst forces them to drink from ditches where human and animal bodies lie. At times, blood is collected from a slaughtered horse, heated over a fire, eaten coagulated, without salt. The body enters a regime of continuous loss. Everything consumed merely allows walking to continue, never repairing what has been spent. As hunger lengthens, bonds dissolve. Help becomes rare, not from deliberate cruelty, but because stopping often means not rising again. No one can afford to slow down. Suspicion replaces companionship. Each man guards what little he still carries, what little he can still swallow. Discipline does not explode, it empties. The army continues to exist, but no longer as a community. For those crossing Russian soil, there is no concept at work. There is only the repeated experience that everything functions formally and fails in practice. Emptiness is not understood as strategy, but as the physical absence of anything that would allow the military machine to continue operating as a system. At the lowest point of this process, imperial war collapses into primitive gestures. Finding nothing on the surface, soldiers begin probing the ground with musket butts, attentive to minimal differences in earth, moss, or replanted trees. Survival depends on hurried excavations, as if the entire army had been pushed beneath the surface. The campaign does not end here. It continues, stripped of promise, with men digging the earth not to conquer, but simply to keep moving. For weeks, the army had marched after an enemy that always retreated. Empty villages, burned fields, ever longer roads. War seemed made only of movement and frustration. For that reason, when the Russians finally stopped, when they accepted battle, the feeling that passed through the French ranks was not panic, but relief. After so much advance without closure, something would finally concentrate. On the night of September 6th, the men cleaned their weapons, adjusted their equipment, and wrote improvised wills. There was a clear sense that something exceptional was about to occur. The following morning, under weather Bourgogne describes as magnificent, Napoleon rode along the lines. For many, this would be the decisive battle, the confrontation that would end the endless pursuit. Borodino appeared as a promise. At last, the war would stop dragging on. When the fighting began, that promise dissolved almost immediately. For Jakob Walter, there is no solemn opening, no clear inaugural scene. There is only the instant when the world turns into noise and impact. The cannons fire, the ground trembles, the air fills with a continuous roar that allows no pause and no orientation. The field ceases to be landscape and becomes vibration. The sound of artillery organizes time. The trembling earth organizes space. Bourgogne confirms this sensation of crushing immersion. The Moskwa does not open with visible maneuvers, but with the relentless thunder of cannon fire. From the first moments, it becomes clear that Borodino will not be a succession of heroic gestures, but a prolonged descent into a total hostile environment, where the body is constantly shaken, deafened, and pierced. As the day advances, the battle seems to condense around fixed points in the terrain. Earthworks, low hills, entrenched positions. After weeks of marching, war finally concentrates. For Bourgogne, this focus has a precise name, the Great Redoubt. It is there that Napoleon attempts to force the decision everyone expects. On the battlefield itself, the emperor promotes officers, commits divisions, and tries to produce the closure that movement alone had failed to deliver. At the same time, far from this panoramic view, Coignet experiences Borodino as mission. Summoned by Napoleon, he receives direct and urgent orders and crosses the field under heavy fire, running through explosions that tear limbs apart and disorganize everything they touch. A projectile passes so close that it tears the tip from his hat. The charge of the cuirassiers advances heavy and compact against the Russian positions, irresistible and yet exposed. Beside him, General Caulaincourt falls dead. The death of a general interrupts nothing. The charge continues. The field keeps absorbing men with the same indifference with which it absorbs shot and shell. Heroism here does not suspend the massacre. It dissolves inside it. For Bourgogne, the explanation of the battle is simple and terrible. Borodino is not decided by maneuver or sudden genius, but by the massive use of artillery. Throughout the day, tens of thousands of rounds are fired. Cannons determine the outcome by crushing everything that remains standing long enough. The victory is technical, and for that very reason, impossible to absorb on a human level. When Bourgogne records the losses, the numbers immediately turn into faces. At the Great Redoubt, 12 young men from his hometown of Condé fall dead. The battle meant to conclude, the campaign erases in a single day an entire fragment of the world he came from. As the fire diminishes and night approaches, the field reveals what has truly been produced. Jakob Walter describes a terrain that no longer resembles a battlefield, but a cleared forest where bodies replace fallen trunks. Men and horses cover the ground for miles, mixed together, unrecognizable. The water is corrupted by corpses. It cannot be drunk. Wounded men cry out for help that does not come. Others no longer cry at all. Survivors move among them with an indifference that is not cruelty, but absolute exhaustion. After Borodino, the human body seems to have crossed a silent threshold, and yet the system continues to function. For Coignet, the battle ends when he is able to return to the emperor and report the result. On the field itself, among still warm corpses, Napoleon distributes promotions and crosses of honor. A captain is raised to battalion commander right there on blood-soaked ground. Administrative war does not pause. The imperial machine records, rewards, reorganizes. What for some is a newly formed cemetery remains. For others, a space of merit and advancement. Bourgogne ends his account without words of triumph. What remains is the direct vision of the aftermath. He describes Murat moving among wounded Russian guardsmen, overseeing amputations, offering wine to men who have just lost arms and legs. The spectacle is not glorious nor silent. It is sad and terrible. Borodino ends like this. Not with acclamation, not with relief, but with the sound of saws, with severed limbs discarded on the ground, with men struggling to remain conscious as their bodies are reduced. The empire declares victory. Medals shine. Promotions are recorded. But the battle that was meant to close the campaign confirms something far more unsettling. Even at its climax, the war does not resolve itself. The campaign continued. After Borodino, the army advanced not through renewal, but through continuity. Bodies that could still march, marched. The others were left behind. The declared victory did not alter the basic gesture of war. There was no real recomposition, only displacement. The ranks moved forward, thinned out, filled with wounded and exhausted men, many of them carrying on their own bodies the marks of September 7. They marched because marching had always been the rule. When the first columns reached Moscow, they did not find what a conquered capital usually offered. There was no organized resistance in the streets, but neither was there reception, negotiation, or visible submission. The streets were empty. Doors stood open, houses abandoned, churches silent. The sound of footsteps echoed where voices were expected. For many soldiers, this absence produced immediate discomfort. There was no one before whom victory could be affirmed. They entered the city and found no inhabitants. This absence, however, did not mean passivity. Within the first days, isolated gunshots appeared, fired from windows. Alleys ended in ambushes. Houses were turned into improvised positions. Patrols advancing through narrow streets were suddenly fired upon and forced to invade residences where they encountered armed men wielding muskets and spears, many of them drunk, fighting with ferocity. They were not regular soldiers, but neither were they harmless civilians. Conquered Moscow remained a hostile space, fragmented, irregular, unpredictable. The soldiers spread out, attempting to turn the city into shelter. They entered houses, palaces, and churches, opened cabinets, descended into cellars, explored interiors that still held traces of interrupted daily life. This phase became a continuous wandering without clear direction. There were no precise orders on where to stay, no spaces prepared to receive so many men. Each group sought a possible provisional place. The conquered city resisted being inhabited. Fire did not appear as a single flash, but as a progressive transformation of space. At first, columns of smoke rose from distant points, then from places too close. Heat began to precede the sight of flames. Ash fell constantly, mixed with soot. The air grew heavy, difficult to breathe. The fire became a total phenomenon, persistent and organized. Wind tore iron roofing sheets from palaces and churches, carrying them far through the air before they fell, burning onto houses not yet aflame. Streets filled with sparks and fragments of fire. Breathing became difficult. The heat was so intense that it was impossible to remain long in the same place. Fire reappeared even where it had already been fought. Explosives were hidden in clay stoves. Blasts erupted beneath patrols' feet. Incendiaries were caught with torches in their hands inside churches and houses. In one case, a man had to have his wrist cut to force him to release the fuse and attempted to continue the fire with his other hand. Hundreds of such incendiaries were captured inside the Kremlin, many identified as criminals, released and assigned street by street to burn the city. Moscow did not burn from abandonment. It burned from insistence. Houses occupied in the morning had to be abandoned a few hours later. Men awoke surrounded by smoke and heat, forced to leave without knowing where to go. Occupation became unstable. Moscow ceased to be a conquered space and became a medium in combustion, demanding constant movement merely to remain within it. Despite this, a fragile armistice imposed itself during the occupation. Operations ceased without the war being resolved. Reviews and parades followed one another. The military machine still displayed itself, still organized itself, as if form could replace substance. For several weeks, soldiers behaved as if they were inhabitants of Moscow, settled in houses, trading, looting, consuming what the city still offered. The city burned, but the army waited. As shelters disintegrated, soldiers searched for whatever could still be found. They entered abandoned houses, broke doors, rummaged through storage rooms. The gesture was not triumphant, but urgent. Some drank excessively, while others searched for food without success. Alcohol circulated easily, food did not. The city offered things, but it did not sustain bodies. Within this suspended time, attempts were also made to restore familiar forms of social life. On the night of September 27, in some palaces still usable, a ball was held, a kind of carnival. Soldiers wore garments found in the city. Identities shifted. Luxurious fabrics draped over exhausted bodies. The smell of tallow used to improvise hairstyles mixed with the steam of hot punch. Music barely sustained the dancing. Laughter was excessive, almost convulsive. The celebration lasted until dawn, without distinction between costume and fatigue. This armistice, however, did not correspond to real peace. No emissary appeared. No negotiation advanced. Napoleon remained in the city awaiting a response that never came. Meanwhile, Russian forces pressed outside Moscow, and French detachments were attacked. The city offered the appearance of pause, but the encirclement tightened around it. The rupture came abruptly. During a review, a courier reported that the Russians had broken the armistice and launched a surprise attack on Murat's cavalry. The news spread quickly. The order to depart was given. There was no solemn speech, but there was a clear announcement, repeated by officers and accompanied by severe warnings. Suspended time collapsed at once. When the order to leave Moscow began to circulate, it was not received as a complete surprise. Preparing to depart meant abandoning improvised shelters, leaving behind what could not be carried, gathering dispersed columns. The city concluded nothing. It merely revealed that victory no longer offered rest. Movement would resume not as advance, but as necessity. From that point on, marching would no longer be a gesture of conquest, but of survival. The departure from Moscow does not arise from a single impulse, but from an accumulation of evidence that can no longer be ignored. The conquered city did not become shelter, nor a diplomatic bargaining chip. Weeks were spent waiting in a space that refused habitation. Empty streets, non-existent commerce, irregular supplies, nights growing steadily colder. Victory there produced no rest. It produced suspension. During this period, a fragile armistice sustained the illusion of stability. The army remained in the city amid reviews, parades, and inspections. For many soldiers, this time took the shape of a provisional life. They occupied houses, improvised routines, behaved almost like inhabitants of Moscow. But this citizenship was fragile. No treaty was signed. No emissaries arrived. There was only waiting. The rupture came abruptly. In the middle of a review, a courier informed Napoleon that the Russians had broken the armistice and launched a surprise attack on Murat's cavalry. The announcement was followed immediately by orders. A departure date and hour were fixed. October 18, 3 in the morning, accompanied by a blunt warning. Anyone delayed would fall into enemy hands. Quartermasters appeared. Orders circulated. Everything had to be ready to move. There was no solemnity. There was clarity. The decision caused no astonishment because it confirmed what the body already knew. Moscow could no longer be held. Fire reappeared where it had been fought. Isolated shots continued. Explosives were found hidden in houses, stoves, and churches. Incendiaries were captured with torches in their hands. Hundreds were arrested. Patrols were nearly buried by explosions. The city acted against those who tried to remain within it. At the same time, the climate began to change regimes. October was not yet absolute winter, but the warning was already physical. Breath condensed in the morning air. The ground hardened at night. Wind cut through worn uniforms. Discomfort settled in before the snow. It did not kill yet, but it announced. Remaining would mean facing winter without stockpiles, without stable shelter, without secure supply lines. Before departure, the soldiers did what they could. They filled backpacks, bags, improvised sacks. Weeks of accumulated plunder began to be treated as survival reserve. Sugar, rice, biscuits, tea, leather-bound books, gold-embroidered dresses, fragments of religious objects, silverware. The gesture was not triumphant. It was preventive. When the order came into effect, the departure took place at dusk. The convoy was already misshapen from its first step. Carts, wagons, women, children, sutlers, soldiers of every nationality mixed together in irregular lines, 3 or 4 abreast, stretching over more than a league. Noise was constant. Wheels breaking, horses falling, shouts in French, Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, Croatian, Lithuanian, Hungarian, and in the many variants of German and Italian. This was not an orderly retreat that later unraveled. Disorder was structural from the beginning. The convoy almost immediately ground to a halt, not because of direct attack, but because of material impossibility. The road could not bear the volume. Soft sand swallowed wheels. Axles snapped. Exhausted horses fell and did not rise. Advance was blocked by physical bottlenecks, not human decisions. At this point, the body began to impose choices. One man opened his pack by the roadside. The weight, once bearable, now dragged him backward. The first thing abandoned was not luxury, but part of the uniform. To lighten the load, he left behind his white trousers. The gesture repeated itself around him. The road began to fill with clothing, books, valuable objects, discarded without ceremony. Symbolic value dissolved in the face of concrete fatigue. In the days that followed, the retreat assumed an irregular rhythm. The columns stretched, compressed, broke into blocks that no longer knew to whom they belonged. Men marched because those ahead marched. They stopped because those ahead stopped. Some seemed to walk in circles, guiding themselves by tracks in the sand, by fallen bodies, by dead horses. In certain stretches, hours passed without real forward movement. One hope still sustained the march. The route toward Kaluga offered the possibility of escape from the wasteland created by the invasion itself. Less plundered fields, intact granaries, roads not yet crushed by summer traffic. The movement changed tone. Despite exhaustion and disorder, there was a sense of moving towards something, not merely away from Moscow. Some believed that once Kaluga was reached, the army could recompose, feed itself, perhaps even reverse the campaign. The hope was fragile, but sufficient to keep men moving. It did not last. As the army advanced, it became evident that the path was not open. The enemy did not pursue only from the rear. It positioned itself ahead, occupying precisely the chosen route. What had seemed an exit began to narrow. To reach Kaluga, however, it was necessary to pass through Maloyaroslavets, a narrow point on the route, an obligatory passage. There, halfway along the path, hope encountered an enemy already in place. At Maloyaroslavets, the retreat faced something it had not yet confronted directly: an occupied path. The town emerged as a constricted obstacle, wedged between ravines and steep streets. Where combat did not spread, it accumulated. The clash was immediate and repetitive. Ground was taken, lost, retaken, and lost again. In a matter of hours, the town changed hands repeatedly without producing real advance. The fighting was heavy and uneven, ranks exhausted faster than they could be reorganized. Officers fell, attempting to impose cohesion where it no longer existed. Bodies remained where they fell. Under a dense autumn fog, the imperial command, moving and poorly protected, was surprised. There was no alarm at first. Someone thought they heard acclamations, as so many times before. The mistake lasted only seconds. Then the sound changed. The alarm ran through the camp. 2 arms. Then came the shouting. Not in line, not in classical formation, but scattered, rapid, exploiting every fold of terrain. Hidden ravines, uneven ground, everything favored the Cossacks. They were thousands. They advanced directly toward the headquarters perimeter. For the first time since the campaign began, the enemy did not strike a distant rear or an isolated detachment. It reached the center. Napoleon found himself in the middle of the confusion, surrounded by generals and officers who drew their swords not to command, but to protect. There was no time for maneuver, no space for distance. Defense was made with short blows in the fog against a mass that appeared and disappeared at a few meters range. Confusion produced the absurd. An aide-de-camp lost his hat, then his sword. To avoid being defenseless, he seized the lance of a fallen Cossack. In the tumult, a mounted grenadier of the guard saw him advancing with the enemy weapon in his hands. He did not recognize the man. He struck him down. The body fell there, killed not by the enemy, but by the momentary collapse of all distinction. Guard squadrons arrived in open charge, cutting across the plain. The Cossacks dispersed as quickly as they had appeared. The danger receded. The emperor was removed from the center of the confusion. The episode was brief but sufficient. Later, Napoleon was seen speaking with Joachim Murat. He laughed, a short, almost light laugh, a remark about how close he had come to capture. The laugh existed, but it did not erase the essential fact. The retreat had advanced to the point where the enemy could touch the command. After that, nothing returned to place. From that moment on, Army Corps shattered. Officers disappeared. Discipline no longer reformed. Men threw away weapons, packs, anything that slowed the step. The retreat lost its center. Each group fled as it could. For the Baron de Marbot, Maloyaroslavets sealed Napoleon's defeat in Russia. By blocking the route to Kaluga, the Russians closed the last rational exit. The French army was forced back onto the devastated road of its advance under constant pursuit. From that point on, retreat would no longer be chosen. It would be imposed. The decision taken at Maloyaroslavets forced the army back onto a familiar path. There was no new maneuver, no alternative. The retreat followed the same road as the advance, now devastated by that very movement. Days passed without clear distinction. Men marched, stopped, and marched again, always over ground, already worn out, already emptied, already marked by human and material remains. The movement pointed toward no new objective, but toward a place already crossed, now drawing near once more. Smolensk did not offer itself whole. Even the approach imposed compression. After the slope came the gates, and there the column narrowed until it lost all form. Men from different units, mixed without distinction, pushing, falling, being shoved back onto the ice. Some recognized the place not by the walls, but by the river below, by the wind rising from the valley, by the way the road closed in before the entrance. It was the same route as before, now without timber, without houses, without voices. At the approaches, movement stopped and resumed without order, interrupted by sudden falls. One man slipped. Another tripped over him. A third no longer had the strength to pull anyone up. The city stood above them, but entering still required effort, and many sat down on the ice, looking upward as if the body had decided to stop before the will. Inside the walls, streets did not appear, voids did. Where wooden facades had once stood, bare stone walls remained, aligned like exposed bones. Some recognized intersections by memory of fire. Here they had passed through living flames. Here entire depots had burned through the clear nights of August. Now everything was motionless, hardened by cold. The dead from the first passage still lay in the way, darkened, flattened, absorbed into the ground. There was no time to step aside. Feet passed over them, slipped, resumed their rhythm. Smolensk did not feel abandoned. It felt consumed as if something had passed through it and emptied it from within. Memory did not return as narrative, but as mute impact. What had once been alive reappeared, reduced to residue. Churches once intact now stood hollow. Streets once full had become corridors of stone and ice. Memory offered no comfort. It made the ruin heavier, more concrete, more difficult to cross. The cathedral still imposed itself over the city, recognizable from a distance. During the first passage, it had been refuge. People crowded between columns, icons preserved, the murmur of prayers continuing while combat raged outside. Some remembered the surprise of finding only priests there, praying without moving, as if the world had not changed. The interior had seemed separated from the city, protected by something other than walls. Now, as they approached, sound came from within, not chanting, not prayer, but a confused, metallic murmur without rhythm. Inside, men who had fallen behind lay scattered across the floor. Some still breathed, others no longer moved. Bottles rolled between the stone slabs. Someone played the organ without order, tearing irregular notes that echoed beneath the vault. Some sang, others slept where they had collapsed. Near the entrances, bodies were piled simply to clear a passage for the living. Cold held everything in suspension, as if music, drunkenness, and immobility were the same state. Outside the cathedral, the city closed in completely. Cellars buried under snow gave way without warning. Those who fell vanished into darkness. Small portions of flour and stale biscuits passed from hand to hand, swallowed without preparation. Improvised hospitals were too full to function and too empty to save anyone. At night, men gathered against stone walls, sat down to escape the wind, and remained there. Movement continued only as long as the body could still be forced to follow. Leaving Smolensk, the road reappeared marked by scattered remnants. Open barrels, coins frozen into ice, metal plates abandoned beside torn packs. Some still moved forward, bent low, shoulders sunk beneath burdens no longer compatible with marching. Others had stopped there, seated on sacks that glimmered briefly before darkening. Some tried to drag bars slipping from numb hands. Others searched the pockets of motionless bodies, unsure whether they were already dead. For Bourgogne, this marked the definitive passage between an imagined refuge and a march that no longer promised return. Smolensk had not interrupted the retreat. It had merely confirmed that nothing left behind could sustain it. The road continued, ahead, narrow, frozen, laden with remains as the only possible direction. The march moved toward the Berezina. The name had circulated among the men for days, repeated with growing insistence, as if pronouncing it might give the retreat a clear limit. It was said to be the last great obstacle on the road westward, a wide, deep river known to freeze in winter. With temperatures dropping to 25, sometimes 30 degrees below zero, the expectation was simple and desperate at once to find a solid road of ice, wide enough for men, horses, and wagons to cross without stopping. To cross the Berezina meant to remain alive. Not to cross meant disappearance. It was also known that Cossacks followed along the flanks and rear, and that time no longer worked in anyone's favor. The riverbank shattered that hope immediately. The river was not solid. It ran dark, wide, and fast, cutting through the land with a force that felt absurd in such cold. The water remained alive, pushing large ice floes against one another, opening black gaps that closed again in seconds. Thick vapor rose from the surface, deceiving tired eyes. It was not warmth, but moving water, meeting frozen air. At the edge, men stopped, unsure whether to advance or retreat. Some tested the ice with a foot and felt it give way. Others simply stared, understanding that the river offered no passage. Jakob Walter would later reduce the site to its core. There, in the water, lay the grave. Beyond the crossing, only the continuation of a miserable life. There could be no crossing without a bridge. The river ran too deep for a ford and too fast for any organized attempt at swimming. Waiting for full freezing meant remaining motionless under Russian guns. The only option was to build there over running water, with whatever still remained. The problem was that almost nothing remained. A month earlier, during the hurried retreat, Napoleon had ordered the destruction of the pontoon train, boats, wagons, beams to lighten the load and save the artillery horses. What normally allowed great rivers to be crossed no longer existed. Only tools remained. General Jean-Roch, the engineer in charge of the pontooniers, suspecting that a crossing would be unavoidable, had secretly preserved portable forges, anvils, hammers, iron clamps, and coal. Without them, no timber could have been fixed. The bridges were built directly inside the river. They were not floating bridges. The pontooniers had to enter the water to drive wooden supports into the riverbed. Each support was forced into the muddy bottom, forming inclined pairs that would hold the main beams. The water reached the waist, then the chest, then the shoulders. The bottom offered no firmness. The frames sank slowly or tilted under the pressure of the current. To clear space, ice blocks had to be removed by hand. Men broke the ice with axes and pushed it away with bare hands, throwing the slabs into the current. Within minutes, fingers lost all sensation. Arms obeyed only by habit. Across the supports, long transverse beams were laid, and over them, the deck planks. Nothing was nailed. Nothing was fixed. The planks were simply laid in place, held only by weight and urgency. Water passed beneath and over the structure. In several places, the level rose above the planks, making the floor invisible. The constant impact of ice shifted the supports, opening sudden gaps. With each failure, it was necessary to return to the water, adjust, reset, reinforce with clamps forged on the spot. The bridge was never finished. It existed only while someone remained on it working. Many who entered the river did not come out. Some were pulled out alive, bodies rigid and breath short, and died a few hours later when the heat of effort faded. Others simply vanished into the dark water. The bridge advanced meter by meter, sustained by the continuous effort of men who knew they would not cross it. Throughout November 27, the bridges began to fulfill their function. They were never ready, they never would be, but they sustained enough passage for what was still recognized as an army to cross. The order was clear. First the organized infantry, then the artillery, and the few vehicles still able to move. Each unit advanced without stopping, without dispersing, because stopping meant locking the entire fragile structure. The floor offered no safety. The planks floated slightly under weight, shifted with every step, and water rose through the gaps, covering ankles. Still, as long as the flow remained regular, the bridge held. The greatest danger did not come from individual falls, but from interruption. Officers shouted that no one was to stop, no one to help those who fell. Whoever slipped was dragged clear of the passage or disappeared into the water. It was in this continuous movement that Napoleon Bonaparte crossed, not on horseback, but on foot, He advanced leaning on a cane, wrapped in a large fur-lined cloak, wearing a purple velvet cap. He moved surrounded by a tight cordon of guards, separated from the compressed mass at the bridge's entrance. He passed without stopping, without looking back, while the flow was maintained by force. For many veterans, the image carried immediate weight. Seeing the emperor cross the same unstable structure, in the same cold, confirmed that an exit still existed, though not for all. Some wept upon recognizing him. Others resumed their steps simply because they had seen him move forward. Behind him, however, the bridge continued to function without his presence. All day, the organized army continued to cross. Batteries passed one by one, wheels sinking into the wet wood. Each cannon required doubled effort. Each crossing made the bridge sag a few more centimeters. Whenever a beam shifted, the pontooniers returned to the water to reset what had given way, keeping the passage open while there was still something to save. By nightfall, the bulk of what remained of the regular army was already on the far bank. The flow diminished, but did not stop. Behind, those who had failed to keep pace accumulated: wounded, sick, civilians, damaged wagons. Many had watched the bridge function all day and concluded they could cross later. Urgency seemed suspended. Night fell early. The bridges remained there, creaking under intermittent weight, still usable, still sustained by pontooniers who returned to the water whenever something shifted. But the flow was no longer the same. What remained gathered on the banks: stragglers wounded who had marched as far as the body allowed, civilians who had followed since Moscow. Cold slowed every decision. Waiting seemed safer than crossing. Small fires appeared, fed by scraps of wood torn from wagons, broken planks, pieces of furniture looted months earlier and carried there without purpose. Around them, bodies stopped. Some sat merely to rest. Others lay down intending to cross at first light. The problem was not sleeping, but waking. Dawn brought movement. As soon as light dissolved the darkness, the men who had waited through the night rose, almost simultaneously. The cold was sharper than the day before. What had seemed prudence turned into urgency. Everyone wanted to cross and wanted to do so at once. The bridge was used again, but no longer as before. Regular flow vanished. At the entrance, the compressed mass advanced in jerks. Wounded, civilians, and soldiers mixed without order. Those who fell were not lifted. They became obstacles. The bridge, built for continuous passage, began to suffer from abrupt stops and violent resumptions. Planks shifted, sudden gaps opened. Water rose between feet. The floor disappeared. It was then that the Russians became fully present, not as rumor, but as fire. From the heights and the opposite bank, artillery opened on the human concentration. There were no formations to target, only density. Shot fell among wagons, exploded in the middle of the crowd. Fire did not disperse, it compressed. Pressure from behind increased. Each impact made the mass surge forward by reflex, compressing the bridge entrance even more. Crossing ceased to be movement and became crushing. For those on the structure, the world shrank to a few centimeters in front of their feet. Some tried to force their way through. Sabers were used not against the enemy, but against companions. Others were pushed off the bridge, vanishing between ice floes. The bridge still existed, but it no longer led. As the morning advanced, movement became irregular, broken by successive falls. Each stop caused the mass behind to surge by compression, not decision. The shove came before the step. The structure responded by opening gaps. Water gained ground between feet. The first bodies that fell did not disappear immediately. They became lodged between beams, wheels, and hooves. Instead of being removed, they were trampled. Under continuous weight, bones gave way, flesh flattened, and what had been a body became part of the surface. The bridge acquired a new consistency. The river worked without pause. Ice flows struck the supports. With each stronger impact, a section gave way, and men slipped sideways, pulled by the weight of soaked clothing. Some tried to cling, others sank immediately. The water closed as if nothing had happened. Russian artillery continued firing. Shot now fell directly on the bridge and its approaches. Each explosion opened momentary clearings immediately filled by the mass behind. Wounded horses advanced blindly. Wagons broke apart on the structure, spilling useless loads that worsened the blockage. Then, close combat appeared in scattered form. Cossacks emerged along the flanks, reaching the bridge entrance. Low lances, quick blows. For those on the structure, the enemy no longer came only from outside. It came from the shove behind, the fall ahead, and the water below. The pontonniers continued to enter the river almost mechanically. They replaced planks, reinforced supports. Many no longer felt their hands. The bridge held not through strength, but through inertia. Here, crossing ceased to be a choice. Those on the structure could neither advance nor retreat. The only possible gesture was to remain upright. To fall meant disappearance. The morning of November 29 found what remained of the crossing in terminal condition. The bridges still existed, but only as extensions of catastrophe. They no longer organized any passage. They sustained, for moments, those still trying to reach the far bank. Most of the regular army had already crossed. What remained before the river was a mass of stragglers wounded, civilians, isolated soldiers, for whom each minute meant the approach of the end. The decision came from above and was not announced. Orders circulated only among the few who still controlled anything. The bridges had to be destroyed to prevent Russian passage. Fire was set at the ends. The soaked wood resisted at first, but once flames reached the main beams, the structure became unusable within minutes. Those still on the bridge ran without direction. Those waiting understood too late. Some tried to advance despite the fire. Others threw themselves into the river. None reached the far bank. On the side left behind, space dissolved. The Russians advanced to the bank. What had been crossing became closure. For those who had watched the bridge function the day before, the contrast was brutal. In less than 48 hours, the structure had gone from precarious solution to instrument of definitive separation. Jakob Walter would reduce that instant to a decision concentrated in a single point. There, in the water, lay the grave. Beyond the bridge, only the continuation of a miserable life. Adrien Bourgogne would see there the passage between an imagined refuge and a march without return. The Berezina continued to run. Wood burned, gunfire gradually ceased, and the cold remained the same. After that, there was no longer a common movement. There were only isolated survivors, each delivered to his own body. After the Berezina, the campaign did not end with a final battle. It ended by dissolving. What crossed the river was no longer an army, but fragments, columns without command, men without units, bodies moving only because they still could. Discipline did not collapse in a single moment. It simply stopped being relevant. Orders no longer organized movement. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion did. In the weeks that followed, there was no common march. Some reached Vilna, others fell along the road. Thousands disappeared without witness, without record, without name. The campaign continued on paper, but on the ground, it had already ended. Official history would later speak of losses, numbers, and responsibility. But for those who were there, the defeat of the Grande Armée had already happened earlier, when obedience ceased to function, when the body no longer responded, when survival replaced purpose. In 1812, Napoleon did not lose his army in the snow. He lost it when war stopped making sense.